The cold pavement of London's financial district was the last place anyone expected to find a miracle, especially not one involving a black Rolls Royce and a man who hadn't tasted a warm meal in weeks. As passers-by sneered and adjusted their designer coats, one woman did the unthinkable. She stepped out of her luxury vehicle, ignored the cameras of the paparazzi, and knelt in the grime to offer more than just a banknote. She offered a hand. But as she looked into the hollow, weary eyes of the beggar, she had no idea that she wasn't just helping a homeless man. She was looking into the eyes of the person who owned the very ground they were standing on. This is the story of a kindness that shocked the world and a secret that would turn high society upside down. In the heart of a city that never stops moving, Clara Adeyemi was a name that commanded respect. As the CEO of a rising tech firm, she was known for her sharp intellect and her uncompromising ethics. However, in the cutthroat world of international business, her rivals often viewed her compassion as a weakness. On this particular Tuesday, the air was crisp, and the sun was reflecting off the glass towers of the city. Clara was heading to a high-stakes board meeting, her mind racing through financial projections and market shares. Her driver pulled the sleek black Rolls Royce to the curb near a row of high-end boutiques. As the door opened, Clara stepped out, her mahogany silk dress catching the light. Just a few feet away, sitting on a flattened cardboard box, was a man who looked like he had been forgotten by time itself. His clothes were tattered, his beard was matted with dust, and his eyes seemed to hold the weight of 1,000 tragedies. The contrast was jarring. On one side stood the epitome of success, and on the other, the face of absolute poverty. A group of wealthy socialites stood nearby, dressed in vibrant reds and yellows, whispering behind their manicured hands. They laughed softly, pointing at the man as if he were a blot on an otherwise perfect landscape. They expected Clara to walk past him with the same indifference they practiced daily. Instead, Clara stopped. She reached into her handbag and pulled out a stack of bills, but she didn't just drop them and walk away. She leaned down, bringing herself to his level, and spoke to him with a softness that silenced the onlookers. She asked him his name, ignoring the smell of the streets and the judgmental glares of her peers. The man, startled by the genuine warmth in her voice, whispered that his name was Elias. Clara noticed something strange in that moment. Despite his disheveled appearance, Elias had a gaze that was piercing and incredibly calm. There was no desperation in his movements, only a profound sense of exhaustion. As she handed him the money, she felt a strange tug at her heart. She remembered her own humble beginnings back in Lagos, where her mother had taught her that a person's worth is not measured by their bank balance but by the content of their character. The socialites behind her began to titter louder, one of them even making a comment about how Clara was ruining her expensive shoes on the dirty pavement. Clara ignored them entirely. She felt a sudden, impulsive urge to do more. She didn't just want to give him a temporary fix, she wanted to give him a moment of dignity. She invited him to have a meal with her, a gesture that sent shockwaves through the crowd. Elias looked at her with a mixture of confusion and something that looked suspiciously like respect. He hadn't expected this. Usually, people of her status looked through him as if he were invisible. But Clara saw him. She saw the man beneath the rags. As she helped him stand, the paparazzi began snapping photos frantically. The headlines the next morning would surely be scandalous. CEO picks up tramp, they would say. But Clara didn't care about the headlines. She cared about the human being standing in front of her. As they walked toward a nearby cafe, the world around them seemed to fade. She began to talk to him about the city, about the struggles of the modern world, and about the importance of never giving up. Elias listened intently, his silence carrying a weight that Clara couldn't quite explain. Little did she know, this encounter was not a random act of fate. It was the beginning of a transformation that would change her life, and the corporate world, forever. The fallout from Clara's act of kindness was immediate and brutal. By the following afternoon, the images of her standing with Elias had gone viral. In the boardroom of her own company, the atmosphere was icy. Her lead investors, men who valued profit over people, were livid. They argued that her association with a vagrant was damaging the brand's prestige. "We deal with luxury, Clara, not charity cases," one director barked, slamming a newspaper onto the mahogany table. Clara stood her ground, her voice steady and calm. She reminded them that their company was built on the principle of serving the community, but her words fell on deaf ears. The pressure wasn't just coming from work, her family was equally embarrassed. Her sisters, who enjoyed the perks of her success, told her she was making them a laughingstock in their social circles. They couldn't understand why she was wasting time on a man who had nothing to offer. Despite the mounting tension, Clara didn't abandon Elias. In fact, she did something even more radical. She discovered that Elias was actually an old classmate from her university days in Nigeria. She remembered him as a brilliant, quiet student who had vanished shortly after graduation. When she realized who he was, her heart broke. To see such a bright mind reduced to living on the streets was a tragedy she couldn't ignore. She offered him a place to stay in her guest cottage and helped him get clean clothes and medical attention. As the days passed, a deep bond began to form between them. They spent long evenings talking about their dreams and the paths their lives had taken. Elias told her stories of betrayal and loss, of how he had trusted the wrong people and ended up losing everything he owned. Clara listened without judgment, her admiration for his resilience growing with every passing hour. However, the more Clara helped Elias, the more her enemies circled. A rival CEO, a man named Julian Vane, saw an opportunity to take Clara down. He began a smear campaign, suggesting that Clara's relationship with Elias was inappropriate and that she was using company funds to support a secret lover. The rumors grew like wildfire. Clara's stock prices began to dip, and for the first time in her career, she felt the walls closing in. Her board of directors issued an ultimatum. Either she distance herself from the homeless man and issue a public apology, or they would vote to remove her as CEO. It was a moment of profound conflict. Clara had worked her entire life to reach this position. Losing it would mean losing her dream. But looking at Elias, who was finally starting to look like the man he once was, she knew she couldn't turn her back on him. The tension reached a breaking point when Julian Vane arranged a gala, inviting all the city's elite, including Clara's family and board members. He intended to publicly humiliate her. He sent an anonymous tip to the press that Clara would be bringing her beggar boyfriend to the event. When Clara heard about the gala, she knew it was a trap. She sat with Elias in the garden of her home, the weight of the world on her shoulders. She told him about the ultimatum and the risk she was taking. To her surprise, Elias didn't look worried. He looked at her with a steady, confident gaze and told her that true loyalty is the rarest currency in the world. He promised her that no matter what happened at that gala, she would never regret her kindness. He asked her for one favor, to trust him for just one more night. Clara, moved by his sincerity, agreed. She decided she would attend the gala with Elias by her side, ready to face whatever storms awaited them, unaware that the storm was about to change direction. The night of the grand gala arrived, and the ballroom of the Savoy was filled with the scent of expensive perfume and the sound of clinking champagne flutes. Julian Vane stood at the center of a small circle, regaling them with jokes at Clara's expense. He was certain tonight would be the end of her career. When the doors finally swung open, a hush fell over the room. Clara Adeyemi walked in, looking stunning in a deep emerald gown that complemented her regal posture. But it was the man on her arm who caused the collective intake of breath. Gone was the matted beard and the tattered rags. Elias stood tall, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit that fit him perfectly. His hair was neatly trimmed, and he carried himself with an aura of authority that seemed to radiate from his very core. He didn't look like a man who had been saved, he looked like a man who was in charge. The socialites who had mocked him on the street just weeks ago were now whispering in confusion. Who was this man? How could a homeless person transform so completely? Julian Vane stepped forward, a smirk plastered on his face. Clara, dear, how bold of you to bring your project to such an esteemed event, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I hope he knows which fork to use. The room erupted in suppressed giggles. Clara felt a surge of anger, but before she could speak, Elias stepped forward. He didn't look angry, he looked amused. He looked Julian directly in the eye and spoke in a voice that was deep, resonant, and unmistakably powerful. I believe I've used these forks many times before, Julian. In fact, I remember buying this set for the hotel when I acquired the property 3 years ago. The room went silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the thick velvet carpet. Julian's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of sheer terror. What are you talking about? He stammered. Elias reached into his jacket and pulled out a small, unobtrusive gold pin, the insignia of the Dreamchasing Group, the most powerful and secretive private equity firm in the world. My name is Elias Thorne, he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the ballroom. I am the chairman of Dreamchasing Group. And for the last 6 months, I have been living on the streets of London as a social experiment to see who in this city still possesses a shred of human decency. I wanted to know who would help a man with nothing, and who would step on him to get ahead. The revelation was like a physical blow to everyone in the room. The board members who had threatened Clara looked as if they wanted the floor to swallow them whole. Clara's sisters turned pale, realizing they had insulted the wealthiest man in the country. But it was Clara who was the most shocked. She turned to Elias, her eyes wide with disbelief. She had helped him because she thought he was a broken man, not because she thought he was a billionaire. Elias turned to her, his expression softening instantly. Clara, he said, loud enough for everyone to hear, you were the only person who saw me when I was invisible. You risked your reputation, your career, and your family's approval for a stranger. You didn't do it for a reward, you did it because it was right. Julian Vane tried to speak, tried to apologize, but Elias held up a hand. The time for talk is over, Elias said coldly. Tomorrow morning, my firm will be initiating a hostile takeover of every company represented by those who mocked the vulnerable today. Except for one. He looked at Clara. Tomorrow, Clara's firm becomes our primary partner. She is the queen of this industry, and it's time the world treated her as such. The aftermath of the gala was a whirlwind of chaos and justice. True to his word, Elias Thorne unleashed the full power of the Dreamchasing Group. By the time the markets opened the next morning, Julian Vane's empire was crumbling. The investors who had once bullied Clara were now frantically calling her office, begging for a meeting, but she refused to take their calls. They had shown their true colors when they thought she was down, and she had no intention of letting them back into her life. The media, which had once mocked her, now hailed her as a visionary and a saint. But Clara wasn't interested in the fame. She was still trying to process the fact that the man she had rescued from the pavement was the same man who was now reshaping the global economy. Elias moved out of the guest cottage and into a penthouse, but he spent almost every evening with Clara. The power dynamic had shifted, yet their connection remained grounded in the honesty they had shared when he had nothing. One evening, as they sat on Clara's balcony overlooking the city, Elias confessed the full extent of his experiment. He told her how lonely he had been at the top, surrounded by people who only loved his money. He had felt a deep spiritual vacuum and decided that the only way to find truth was to lose everything. He told her that he had almost given up hope after months of being ignored and spat upon. I was at my lowest point that day by the Rolls Royce, he admitted, his voice thick with emotion. I was ready to end the experiment and go back to my cold, empty life. And then you stepped out of that car. He took her hand, and for the first time, Clara saw tears in the eyes of the world's richest man. You didn't just give me money, Clara. You gave me back my faith in humanity. You treated me like a king when I looked like a beggar. Clara realized then that her loyalty had been the ultimate test. If she had listened to her board or her sisters, she would have missed out on the greatest soul she had ever known. The realization hit her with an overwhelming force. Success wasn't about the CEO title or the luxury car, it was about the ability to remain kind in a world that rewarded cruelty. She felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that she had stayed true to her mother's teachings. The emotional peak of their journey came a few weeks later at a private ceremony. Elias had invited Clara to a small orphanage he had funded in secret. There, among children who had nothing, Elias was just Uncle Elias. He showed Clara that his wealth wasn't just for power, but for purpose. He asked Clara to join him, not just as a business partner, but as his partner in life. He proposed to her not with a diamond, but with a simple wooden ring he had carved during his time on the streets. It was a symbol of the man he was when they met, and the man he wanted to be with her. Clara, moved beyond words, accepted. She realized that by choosing to marry the homeless man, she was actually marrying the richest man in the world, not because of his billions, but because of his heart. The greedy people who had tried to destroy her were now nothing more than a footnote in her story, while she was being crowned a queen in the eyes of the man who truly mattered. The wedding of Clara Adeyemi and Elias Thorne was the event of the decade, but it wasn't held in a cathedral or a five-star hotel. Instead, they chose to hold it in a community garden in a humble neighborhood, surrounded by the people the world often ignores. There were no celebrities, only the friends Elias had made on the streets and the employees Clara had treated with respect throughout her career. As they exchanged vows, there wasn't a dry eye in the crowd. Clara's family, who had eventually come around after realizing their mistake, watched from the back, humbled and quieted by the display of genuine love. They had learned a hard lesson, that prestige is fleeting, but character is eternal. Julian Vane and the treacherous board members were nowhere to be found. Their names had become synonymous with corporate greed and moral bankruptcy. They had lost their positions, their fortunes, and their reputations. In the end, their attempt to shame Clara had only served to expose their own ugliness. The resolution was complete. The homeless man had found a home in the heart of a woman who loved him for who he was, and the kind CEO had found a partner who matched her spirit in every way. Together, they turned the Dreamchasing Group into a force for global good, focusing on housing, education, and dignity for the displaced. They proved that business could be conducted with a soul and that the greatest investment one can make is in another human being. The lesson of their story spread far beyond the borders of the city. It became a modern parable about the dangers of judgment and the transformative power of empathy. People began to look at the homeless differently, wondering what stories were hidden beneath the rags. They began to question the value of a society that prizes wealth over warmth. Clara and Elias didn't just change their own lives, they shifted the consciousness of an entire industry. They lived their lives with an open-door policy, always remembering the day on the pavement where it all began. They kept the piece of cardboard Elias had sat on in a frame in their hallway, a constant reminder of where they had come from and what truly mattered. As we close this story, remember that every person you pass on the street has a story. Behind every pair of weary eyes is a soul that deserves to be seen. You never know if the person you help today might be the one who changes your world tomorrow. Clara Adeyemi chose kindness when it cost her everything, and in return, she gained a kingdom. Don't let the noise of the world drown out the whisper of your heart. Be the person who stops. Be the person who sees. Because in the end, the only thing we truly take with us is the love we gave away and the lives we touched along the way. May you find the courage to be kind, even when no one is watching, and may you find the richness that can never be deposited in a bank. Wealth is a shadow, but love is the sun. Walk in the light.